Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I hope you can hear me now. Sharon in New Jersey, Yehud in South Carolina, Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck, Renee in Indiana, Shandor in the Bronx, Bella in Florida, Gail in Kansas City, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Nancy, North Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Jonathan in Thousand Oaks. Has the sound returned? There we go, says Bill. Yes, I can hear, says Yehudit. Yes, got it. Okay. We replaced the camera, and the camera works better for recording and being consistent. But it's a little bit different system, and I had a problem getting in. I had a problem going out. I have to reconfigure the sound every time, which is sort of annoying, but not that interesting. Who else? Moishi in Brooklyn, Aoife in Florida, Chaim in Florida, Lisa in Virginia. And everyone was complaining about the sound on the YouTube side. Thank you. But Marie in New York and can hear now. Everybody can hear now. Okay, good. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's class, I'd like to dedicate to Rabbi Shlomo Schwartz, known to everyone as Schwartzy. I believe this is his 9th yard site. He was a very, very special character, larger than life. I think he was the first campus Chabad rabbi when he came out to California, and he was at UCLA for a number of years. He ended up creating his own outreach organization called Chai Center, which is now run by his son, Rabbi Mendel Schwartz, doing an amazing job. Huge shoes to fill. And Mendel is doing a great job. And I know Schwartz, he's so proud of you. And I mean, the Schwartz clan, they're succeeding in so many ways, in so many places. Lots of kids. Several are Chabad rabbis serving in their town, in various towns in the world, making music, creating. One's a chef. Meish, I think, is the Chabad rabbi in the Boston area. I forget exactly where. But I know Schwartz is smiling down on them and on us. One of his, something that was so important to him was that Jews should marry Jews and make Jewish babies. And I think he was personally responsible for, I don't know how many Jewish couples finding each other and producing children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He was a redhead like me with a big red beard, tragically taken from us at way too young an age. Schwartzy, I miss you. And he was so instrumental in my journey and finding my way back to Judaism. And the fact that, I'm teaching you Daf Yomi now, and everyone who's joining our class every night and has been for years, I think would just give him so much nachas. I know he's smiling from Shemayim, from heaven, on the fact that we're having this class together. So Schwartzy, you're at the highest levels of heaven already. May our learning tonight just take you one little millimeter, whatever, one little bit higher. We miss you, we love you, and on your yard site, dedicating our learning to you tonight. Okay. Our daf tonight is page 19 here in Tractate Menachot, the 30th volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 2 in chapter 3. And here we were talking about certain errors that could be made that would not disqualify the meal offering. Because they are not indispensable to the offering, as opposed to if you make an error with respect to something that is indispensable to the meal offering, it would be disqualified. So apropos, we got a good head start on page 19a yesterday. So I would say we're about a third of the way down on 19a. Apropos the Mishnah's list of rites that are not indispensable for the meal offering, the Gemara explains that Rav says, with regard to any sacrificial rite, where the term law and statute, right? Where both words, law and statute, so mishpah and or chukah and Torah, are stated, right? Torah can mean teaching, and it can also mean sometimes the law, not surprising. Right, so here they're talking about where Torah v'chukah, right? So the law and the statute are stated. So why are both words stated? They are stated only to teach that the absence of the performance of that rite would invalidate the offering, right? If the Torah goes out of its way to say that this is the law and the statute of the meal offering, and then it mentions something about the meal offering, it's to tell you that that item is indispensable to the meal offering, and if you didn't do it, or if you did it wrong, it would be invalidated. And now the Gemara comments, it enters our mind to say that the two terms are both required for this principle to be in effect. Okay, so they're saying if either Torah or chukah are stated, then it would be indispensable, not necessarily that both are stated, right? So now the Gemara asks, well, maybe it's required that both words be stated before it become indispensable. It enters our mind to say that the two terms are both required for this principle to be in effect, as it is written with regard to the red heifer. This is the statute of the law, right? Both words are mentioned with respect to the red heifer, which the ashes of which were required to create the waters of sprinkling so that a person could become purified from corpse tuma, so that they could bring an offering and step inside the temple, etc. Now, before continuing its discussion of this principle, the Gemara presents a mnemonic for the questions that follow. If you were seeking to memorize the entire Gemara, this would be very helpful to you. So, Nun Taf Tzadi Yod Kuf Mem Lamed. This is going to be representing the Nazir, the Toda, the Mitzorah, the Yom Kippur offering, offerings in general, Korbanos, the meal offering, which is the Mincha, and the showbreads on the table in the sanctuary, the Lechem Hapanim. Okay, so the Gemara asks, but what of the offering of a Nazir, about which it is written only law? Right there, it's only written the Torah of it. It says, this is the law of the Nazir who vows, and of his offering to the Lord for his Naziris, besides that for which his means suffice according to his vow, which he vows, so must he do after the law of his Naziris. That's number 621. And yet, Rav says that the lack of waiving of the offering by a Nazir invalidates his offering, right? It says law, it doesn't say law and statute, and yet all these items are going to be indispensable, so this would be a proof that you don't need it to say both law and statute, but if it says law or statute, indispensable. And the Gemara answers, there it is different, since it is written in the continuation of the verse, so must he do, and therefore it is considered as if the term statute were written with regard to it. So we haven't proven that perhaps you do need it to say both law and statute for every element to be indispensable, since here where it only said law and the items were indispensable, it also had this additional phrase, so must he do. So the Gemara asks, okay, well, what about the thanks offering, the toida, about which it is written only law? As the verse states, this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings in Leviticus 7:11. And we learned in a Mishna on page 20, or we will learn on page 27a, that with regard to the 4 types of loaves that accompany the toida, failure to bring each of them prevents fulfillment of the mitzvah with the others. And the Gemara answers, the toida, the thanks offering, is different, since it is juxtaposed in the Torah to the offering of a Nazir, as it is written in a verse describing the toida with the sacrifice of his peace offerings for thanksgiving, instead of simply stating the sacrifice of his thanks offering. And the Master says the term, his peace offering, serves to include the loaves of the peace offering of the Nazir, to teach that the same laws apply to both. And so since the phrase, so must he do, was included for the Nazir, we're going to extend that over here to the Toida. So the fact that it only says law does not, and the items, the sub-rituals are indispensable, that doesn't prove that you need it to say, that you don't need it to say law and Torah for all items to be indispensable, because like the Nazir, this is a special case. Let's go to another special case. What about the offering of the Mitzorah, the one who has tsaras, the skin condition, which is a physical expression of a spiritual malady? What about the offering of the Mitzorah, about which it is written only law? As the verse states, this shall be the law of the Mitzorah in Numbers 14:2. And we learn in a Mishna on page 27a that with regard to the 4 species that are used in the purification process of the Mitzorah, i.e. cedar, hyssop, scarlet wool, and birds, failure to bring each of them prevents fulfillment of the mitzvah with the others. So the Gemara answers, there also it is different, since it is written, this shall be the law of the Mitzorah. Due to the added emphasis of the term shall be, it is considered as if the term statute were written with regard to it. Okay, the Gemara asks, what about the offerings of Yom Kippur, about which it is written only statute, not law and statute? And as the verse states, and it shall be a statute for you forever, in Leviticus 16:29. And we learn in that Mishna on page 27 that with regard to the 2 goats of Yom Kippur, the absence of each goat prevents fulfillment of the mitzvah with the other. So rather, it must be that Rav meant that wherever either the term law or the term statute is employed, this signifies that the rite is an indispensable requirement, which seems to be what our understanding was and is. But now the Gemara questions this understanding of Rav's statement. But what of the rest of the offerings, as the term law is written with regard to them, and yet failure to perform all of their different rites does not invalidate those offerings? The verse states, this is the law of the burnt offering, of the meal offering, and of the sin offering, and of the guilt offering, and of the consecration offering, and of the sacrifice of peace offerings in Leviticus 7:37. And there are some aspects of those rituals that will not invalidate the offering. And the Gemara answers, when the term law appears, it is still necessary for the term statute to appear in order to teach that failure to perform the rites invalidates the offering. But when the term statute appears, it is not necessary for the term law to appear as well. The term statute is sufficient. If you have statute, everything is indispensable. If you have law, it might be that everything is indispensable, but it sounds like you are going to need to get the word statute in there. Now, the Gemara questions this explanation. Is this going to be consistently found everywhere in the Torah where these things appear? But doesn't Rav say wherever the terms law and statute appear? So apparently both are necessary for the principle to apply. Gemara answers, this is what Rav is saying. Even in a context where the term law is written, if the term statute is written as well, then yes, failure to perform the rites invalidates the offering. But if the term statute does not accompany the term law by itself, then failure to perform all of the rites does not invalidate the offering. Okay, Gemara is going to challenge this understanding. But what of the meal offering? The meal offering here in Tractate Menachot. As the term statute, which seems to imply everything is indispensable, is written with regard to it, as the verse states, every male among the children of Aaron may eat of it as a statute forever. And yet, Rav says with regard to every sacrificial rite of the law of the meal offering that the verse repeats, as the details of the meal offering are discussed in Leviticus chapter 2 and again in Leviticus chapter 6. Why is it repeated? It is repeated only to teach that the failure to perform that rite invalidates the offering. But why would we need to repeat it if the word statute is mentioned with it, and the word statute teaches us that every law that's mentioned with respect to that ritual is indispensable? Doesn't this demonstrate that where the verse repeated the command, then yes, failure to perform the rite invalidates the offering, but if the verse did not repeat it, then failure to perform the rite does not invalidate the offering, whether or not the term statute appears? And the Gemara answers, there it is different. As when the term statute is written, it is written with regard to the eating of the meal offering by Aaron and his sons, rather than with regard to the sacrificial rites. Got to be careful where the term statute is mentioned. What is it actually referring to? The Gemara asks, okay, let's look at the showbread, the lechem hapanim, where when the term statute is written, it is written with regard to the eating of the showbread. And who eats the showbread? The Kohanim, the sons of Aaron. As the verse states, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him of the offerings of the Lord made by fire, a perpetual statute. Leviticus 24:9. And we learn in the Mishna on page 27, with regard to the two arrangements of the showbread, failure to place each of the arrangements prevents fulfillment of the mitzvah with the other. So with regard to the two bowls of frankincense that accompany the showbread, failure to place each of the arrangements prevents fulfillment of the mitzvah with the other. And with regard to the arrangements of the showbread and the bowls of the frankincense, failure to bring each of them prevents fulfillment of the mitzvah with the other. So rather, it must be that anywhere that the term statute is written with regard to eating, it is written with regard to the entire matter, i.e. all the laws of the offering. And it teaches that failure to perform the rites invalidates the offering. So we're back to statute is enough. And the Gemara answers there with regard to the meal offering, it is different. And it is only the rites that are repeated that are indispensable, as the verse states, of its groats and of its oil in Leviticus 2:16, rather than simply of the groats and oil. Of its groats and of its oil, as opposed to of the groats and oil. Does everyone know what groats are? I had to look that up. Groats it's not a food in itself. It's when you take grain and you crush it in a certain way, you turn it into groats. You can have oat groats or wheat groats. Right? In fact, in the Koran Tanakh, right, in the Bible, translated and published by Koran, where it says groats here in Leviticus 2:16, it just says the crushed new grain. It doesn't use the word groats. Okay. Now we're on page 19b. So where it was taught with greater specificity, right, of its groats and of its oil, rather than simply of the groats and oil, the Torah is teaching that the groats and oil are indispensable and nothing else is indispensable, despite the fact that the term statute appears. Now, the Gemara discusses the matter itself. Rav says, with regard to every sacrificial rite of the meal offering, right, of the mincha, that the verse in the Torah repeats. It is repeated only to teach that failure to perform that rite invalidates the offering. And Shmuel says, only the groats and oil are indispensable and nothing else is indispensable. And the Gemara asks, and according to Shmuel, is it true that even though a rite of the meal offering is repeated in another verse, he does not deem it indispensable? Rather, Shmuel must agree that wherever the verse repeats a rite, R-I-T-E, it is certainly understood to be indispensable. And in this situation, Rav and Shmuel disagree with regard to the expressions his handful in Leviticus 2:2 and with his hand in Leviticus 6:8. As it is taught in the Baraisa, the verse states, and he shall remove his handful, and elsewhere it states, and he shall take up from it with his hand. And the change in terminology between the two verses teaches that the priest should not use a utensil to measure an amount for the handful of a meal offering, but should use his hand, right? When the priest is removing the komets, the handful, using the process of kemitza, right? He takes his hand like this and he sticks his fingers into the meal offering and, right, collects with those three fingers like this, and then he pulls it out. That's the handful, right? He should not measure that amount separately and then take it in his hand. He does it like this with his hand. Then he's going to put that into a service vessel, which sanctifies the handful. And then he'll take that to the altar and burn the handful on the altar. And as we'll learn, before he burns it on the altar, he's going to add something to that handful, which is in a service vessel, namely frankincense and salt, and then he will burn it. Where am I? Right? So he should not use a vessel to measure the handful. He takes the handful with his hand. So Rav holds that this law of using one's hand and not a utensil is also repeated in another verse, as it is written in the context of Aaron's service on the 8th day of the consecration of the tabernacle, the Mishkan. And he presented the meal offering and he filled his hand from it in Leviticus 9:17, demonstrating that the handful is removed by hand and not with a utensil. And Shmuel holds that we do not derive the law for all generations from a temporary situation. What was done at the inauguration, one-time event, doesn't necessarily teach how future priests will do it in other generations. Excuse me. Therefore, using one's hand, according to that view, is not indispensable, according to Shmuel, as the general requirements of the rites of the meal offering cannot be derived from a verse referring to the meal offering that was sacrificed during the consecration of the tabernacle in the wilderness. The Gemara asks, and does Shmuel not derive the law for all generations from a temporary situation? But didn't we learn in a Mishna in Tractate Zevachim, page 88, service vessels used for the liquids sanctify only the liquids placed in them, and service vessels used to measure dry substances sanctify only the dry substances that are placed in them. That is the law. But service vessels used for liquids do not sanctify the dry substances placed in them, and service vessels used to measure dry substances do not sanctify liquids if liquids are placed in them. And Shmuel says concerning this Mishnah, they taught that law only with regard to service vessels used to measure liquids, for example, wine or oil. But cups, which are used for collecting the blood of offerings, do sanctify dry substances if dry substances were placed into them. As it is written with regard to the offerings of the princes during the inauguration of the tabernacle, 1 silver cup of 70 shekels after the shekel of the sanctuary, both of them full of fine flour mingled with oil for a meal offering, indicating that the cups were also fashioned for use with flour, a dry substance. In this case, Shmuel does derive the general law from a temporary situation, in this case, the offerings of the princes. Yes, but the offerings of the princes were the service vessels that would be used not just during the inauguration. They were brought during the inauguration, but then they became the service vessels used in the tabernacle for many generations after that. But let's keep reading. And the Gemara answers, there, with regard to the offering of the princes, it is different, as the verse is repeated 12 times, once with regard to each and every prince. Therefore, Shmuel derives a law for all generations from it. Nevertheless, generally speaking, the law for all generations cannot be derived from a temporary situation. Now, the Gemara returns to discussing Rav's statement that a rite is deemed indispensable if it is repeated in different verses, namely in chapter 2 and in chapter 6 of Leviticus with respect to a meal offering. So Rav Kahana and Rav Asi said to Rav, but what of bringing the meal offering to the corner of the altar, which is repeated in the verse as it is stated, and he shall bring it to the altar in Leviticus 2:8, and yet it is not indispensable, as stated in the Mishna on page 18. And the Gemara elaborates, where is it repeated? As it is written, and this is the law of the meal offering, the sons of Aaron shall sacrifice it before the Lord in front of the altar. That's in Leviticus 6:7. So the Gemara answers, that verse is not a repetition of the mitzvah for the priest to bring the meal offering to the corner of the altar. Rather, it comes only to establish the place for the meal offering and describe where it should be brought. As it is taught in a Baraisa, the verse states, quote, and this is the law of the meal offering, the sons of Aaron shall sacrifice it before the Lord in front of the altar. And from the phrase, before the Lord, one might have thought that the meal offering must be brought on the western side of the altar, which faces the sanctuary, and is therefore before the Lord. Therefore, the verse states, in front of the altar, which is its southern side, where the priests ascend the ramp. And the Baraisa continues, if the verse had merely stated in front of the altar, one might have thought that the meal offering is brought only on the southern side of the altar, as just mentioned. Therefore, the verse also states before the Lord, which indicates the western side. And how do we reconcile these texts? The priest brings it near the southwest corner of the altar, opposite the edge of the corner of the altar, and that will suffice for him. That's where meal offerings are brought, the southwest corner of the altar, because it satisfies both of these requirements, in front of the altar and before the Lord. Now that Baraisa continues, Rabbi Eliezer says, one might have thought that the verse presents the priest with the option that he may bring it on the western side of the corner or on the southern side of the corner. You say the following principle. Anytime you find two verses, one of which fulfills itself and fulfills the other, and one of which fulfills itself and negates the other, so we set aside the verse that fulfills itself and negates the other, and we seize the verse that fulfills itself and fulfills the other. And he explains, as when you say to bring the meal offering before the Lord, which indicates that it shall be brought on the western side, you have nullified the other part of the verse, which states to bring it in front of the altar, which is the southern side. But when you say to bring the meal offering in front of the altar, and you offer it on the southern side, you have also fulfilled the other part of the verse, which states before the Lord, since the whole altar is, to the east of the sanctuary, and that's what makes it before the Lord. Now, the Gemara, and more or less opposite the entrance to the sanctuary. So the Gemara asks, but if one brought the meal offering on the southern side, which is where the ramp is, where have you fulfilled the requirement before the Lord? And Rav Ashi said, this Tana, i.e. Rabbi Eliezer, holds that the entire altar stood in the northern part of the temple courtyard. The southern side of the altar was aligned with the midpoint of the temple courtyard, opposite the Holy of Holies, therefore in front of the entrance to the sanctuary, and that makes it directly before the Lord. The ramp was before the Lord. In any event, it can be seen in this Baraisa that the purpose of the verse, the sons of Aaron shall offer it before the Lord in front of the altar, is to establish the precise location where the meal offering is brought, and it is not a repetition of what it said in Leviticus 2, he shall bring it to the altar. These are teaching different things. One is bring it to the altar, the other is where in the courtyard, where on the altar shall it be offered. Now, the Gemara cites another objection to Rav's statement that a rite of the meal offering is deemed indispensable if it is repeated in the verses. So Rav Huna objects to this, and he says, but what of the placement of the salt on the handful of the meal offering before it is burned, which is not repeated in the verse, and yet it is still indispensable in its sacrifice. As it is taught in Baraisa, the verse states, it is an everlasting covenant of salt. That's in a whole other place in the Torah. That's in Numbers 18:19, which teaches that there will be a covenant stated with regard to salt, ensuring that the offerings should always be salted, right? All offerings which rise onto the altar have to have salt along with them. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, it is stated here, it is an everlasting covenant of salt, Numbers 18:19, and it is stated there with regard to the reward given to Pinchas, the covenant of an everlasting priesthood in Numbers 25:13. And this teaches that just as it is impossible for the offerings to be sacrificed without the involvement of the priesthood, so too it is impossible for the offerings to be sacrificed without salt. So the Baraisa demonstrates that the rite of salting is an indispensable requirement, despite the fact that the rite is not repeated in the verses. Now we're on page 20a. Rav Yosef said, Rav, who holds that the only sacrificial rites that are indispensable are the ones that are repeated in the verses. We're talking about meal offerings, so therefore in Leviticus 2 and 6. Right? Who holds that the only sacrificial rites that are indispensable are the ones repeated in the verses, holds in accordance with the Tana of our Mishna, who says, if one did not add salt, the meal offering is still fit. That's very interesting, right? So we said elsewhere in the Torah that all offerings will be accompanied by salt. Okay, well, you might say, well, yeah, lechatchila, right? In it, before the fact, that's the right way to do it. You must add salt. But after the fact, if you didn't add salt, would it still be considered fit or not? So according to this view, since salt wasn't mentioned in the repeated verses with respect to the meal offering, it is not indispensable. The other view is, well, no, the Torah said elsewhere, all offerings have to be salted. So how can you say that any offering that was brought without salt could somehow still be fit? Abaye said to him, if that is so, and you understand the Mishnah to be referring to a case where no salt is added at all, then you should also understand the Mishnah's statement if one did not pour the oil as referring to a case where he did not pour oil at all. But what did we learn yesterday? Our Mishnah is not talking about if no oil was included. There are certain meal offerings that must have oil. What the Mishnah was saying is that if a priest didn't add the oil, it's still fit. So this other view is if salt was not added at all, no, it's not fit. But if the salt was added not by a priest, maybe the offering is still fit. That's going to be problematic because what we said yesterday was from the time the handful is removed until it is burned on the altar, all those steps have to be done by a priest. Well, when is the salt added? After the handful is removed. So let's see. Right, with respect to the oil, are you going to say that if no oil was added, it's still a fit offering? No, this cannot be, as the rite of pouring the oil is repeated in the verses, and it is clearly indispensable. So rather, our Mishnah must be referring to a case where a priest did not pour oil onto the meal offering, but a non-priest did pour the oil. So here too, the Tana of the Mishnah means only that a priest did not add salt, but a non-priest did add salt. If no salt is added, even this Tana holds that the meal offering is unfit. So Rabbi Yosef says to Abaye, but how could it enter your mind that a non-priest would approach the altar to salt the handful of the meal offering? A non-priest may not enter the area near the altar. Since it is not conceivable that this would take place, it must be that when the ruling that the meal offering is fit, that when he ruled that the meal offering is fit, even if the salt was not added, the Tana of the Mishnah is referring to a case where no salt was added. He can't be referring to a case where a non-priest adds the salt because the salt is added at the altar, and that's a section of the Temple Mount where no non-priest can go. And if you wish, say instead that Rav holds that since with regard to the application of salt, the term covenant is written about it, it is considered as though it was repeated in another verse, as the term covenant teaches that it is an indispensable rite. Now, with regard to the question that was raised to challenge this statement of Rav, the Gemara asks, and is it correct that the application of salt is not repeated in the verse? But isn't it written, and every meal offering of yours you shall season with salt? Leviticus 2:13. And the Gemara answers, that verse does not function as a repetition, since it is necessary for that which is taught in a brisa. Had the verse stated only, and every offering you shall season with salt, I would derive that this applies to even the wood and the blood, which are also termed an offering, right? There are things that you bring to the altar that we don't add salt to them. What is that? The blood which gets sprinkled, the wood that gets burned on the altar. We don't add salt to those, even though they are sometimes referred to as an offering. What do we add salt to? The handful that's burned on the altar, or the sacrificial portions of animal offerings that are burned on the altar. Now, so the wood and the blood, those are also termed an offering. So, to counter this understanding, the verse states, and every meal offering of yours, and this teaches that just as the meal offering is unique in that other items come as a requirement for it, as the wood is required for the burning of the handful of the meal offering, so too any item that is unique in that other items come as a requirement for it requires the application of salt, right? So that would suggest like the meat that is burned on the altar or the handful that is burned on the altar. By contrast, the wood and the blood, they do not require salting, as the wood itself requires no wood. The wood is the wood. And the blood is presented on the altar. It does not require wood. Now the Baraisa continues, if that logic is employed, one could say, just as the handful of the meal offering that is burned is unique in that it permits the remainder of the meal offering to be eaten by the priests, and it requires salting, so too, any item that is unique in that it permits other items requires the application of salt. Accordingly, we should include blood in the obligation to be salted, as sprinkling the blood on the altar permits the offering to be sacrificed, either the parts that are burned to be burned on the altar, or the parts that are eaten to be eaten by the priest, right? The blood is the permitting factor for animal offerings. So why don't we add salt to the blood of an animal offering before it's sprinkled on the altar? Well, to counter such an idea, the continuation of the verse states, neither shall you offer the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your meal offering, demonstrating that it cannot be lacking from the meal offering, but it would not apply to the blood. And the Baraisa continues, one might have thought that the entire meal offering requires salting, including the remainder of the offering that is eaten by the priest. Perhaps we require salt be added to that. To counter this idea, the verse in the Torah states, and every meal offering, korban, of yours you shall season with salt, teaching that the handful which is burned on the altar as a korban, as an offering, it requires salting. But the rest of the meal offering, the mincha, does not require salting. And I have derived only that the handful of a meal offering requires salting. From where is it derived to include the frankincense, which also accompanies the handful and is also burned on the altar, that it is also required to be salted, right? The frankincense that's burned on the altar along with a meal offering, that is a korban, and it does get salted before it's burned. How do I know that? I include the frankincense due to the fact that it comes along with the handful in one vessel and is therefore included in the expression korban, offering. From where is it derived to include the requirement to be salted, the frankincense that comes by itself as a separate offering, right? Which frankincense comes by itself? The frankincense from the table in the sanctuary where it sits alongside the showbreads, right? The lechem hapanim. So when you burn that bowl of frankincense on the altar, do we add salt to that frankincense? Yes, we do. How do we know that? It's not accompanying anything. One may accept the obligation to bring an offering of frankincense to be burned on the altar. From where is it derived that this frankincense requires salting? Moreover, from where is it derived to include in the requirement to be salted the frankincense that comes in bowls together with the showbread and the incense? The incense gets salted? That's interesting. Moreover, from where is it derived in the requirement of salting in the case of the meal offerings from which a handful is not removed? Right? So the meal offering of priests, that's a special kind of meal offering, no handful is taken from it because the entire meal offering is burned on the altar. Right? That's a special meal offering of the priests. From where is it derived in the requirement of salting in the case of the meal offerings from which a handful is not removed, i.e. the meal offering of priests, and the meal offering of the anointed priest that is brought every day by the high priest, and the meal offering that accompanies the libations brought with burnt offerings and peace offerings? From where is it derived in the requirement of salting with regard to the sacrificial portions of the sin offering that are consumed on the altar, and the sacrificial portions of the guilt offering, the sacrificial portions of the offering of the most sacred order, and the sacrificial portions of offerings of lesser sanctity, and the limbs of the burnt offering, and the bird burnt offering? All of these go up on the altar. From where is it derived that all these require salting? How would we know that? And the Baraisa continues, therefore the verse states, you shall sacrifice salt with all your offerings, demonstrating that everything burned on the altar requires salting. And from this Baraisa it is apparent that the mitzvah to apply salt is necessary in order to teach about the circumstances where salt is added, and therefore it cannot be used as an instance where the mitzvah is repeated in order to teach that that rite is indispensable. So, if a meal offering that requires salting was brought without salt, is it going to be valid after the fact? I'm going to just read what it says here about a covenant stated with regard to salt. There is a positive mitzvah to apply salt to all offerings before sacrificing them on the altar. One who sacrifices an offering that has not been salted is punished with lashes, although the offering is still fit. Right? So it is a positive mitzvah. You're commanded to add salt, but if for some reason the salt was left out, the offering is still fit. Okay. Now, the Gemara discusses the Baraisa cited above. The master said, I have derived only that the handful of a meal offering, the handful that you remove from a meal offering, requires salting. From where is it derived to include the frankincense, which is also burned on the altar, in the requirements to be salted? I include the frankincense due to the fact that it comes along with the handful in one vessel, and therefore it is included in the expression offering. And the Gemara asks, why is this verse needed? But didn't you state earlier that just as a meal offering is unique in that other items come as a requirement for it, as the wood is required for the burning of the handful of the meal offering, so too, anything that is unique in that other items come as a requirement requires the application of salt. Therefore, it is already known that the frankincense and all other items that are burned require salting, since wood is required for their burning. And the Gemara answers, when the Tana says, I've derived only that the handful of the meal offering requires salting, this is what he is saying. One might understand the verse, and every meal offering of yours you shall season with salt, differently, and say the following exposition. The term offering that appears here is a generalization, while the term meal offering is a detail. And according to the hermeneutical principle of a generalization followed by a detail, there is nothing in the generalization other than what is in the detail. Meaning, in the case of a meal offering, yes, it requires salting, but anything else does not require salting. From where then is the law of salting in all other cases derived? Therefore, the verse states, you shall sacrifice salt with all your offerings. And it then generalized again, so that the verse includes a generalization and a detail and a generalization. In which case, according to the hermeneutical principle, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. So just as the specified detail, i.e. the meal offering, is unique in that other items come as a requirement for it, so too anything that is unique in that other items come as a requirement for it requires the application of salt. And that is why the latter part of the verse is needed. And the Gemara explains, what are the other items that come as a requirement for the meal offering? This is referring to the wood, as the wood is required for the burning of the handful of the meal offering. And so too the expression, anything that is unique and that other items come in requirement for it, is referring to anything that requires wood so that it may be burned on the altar, and anything that requires wood so that it may be burned on the altar also requires salt. Gemara asks, why not say that the other items that come as a requirement for the meal offering, why are we saying that applies to the wood? Why don't we say it's the frankincense? The frankincense is required so that the meal offering, the handful of the meal offering may be burned on the altar. Why not say that anything that is accompanied by frankincense requires salt, to the exclusion of all the sacrificial portions of animal offerings which don't get accompanied by frankincense? Why don't we say that? Why not say that the other items that come as a requirement for the meal offering, that this is referring to the frankincense which accompanies the meal offering, and therefore by means of the hermeneutical principle applying to generalization and a detail and a generalization, we would include blood, which is accompanied by libations. And the Gemara answers, the libations are not considered to accompany the sprinkling of the blood. Rather, they accompany the sacrificial portions that are burned on the altar. What is the reason? It is because the burning of the sacrificial parts of the animal offerings and the pouring of the libations which accompany them are the eating and drinking of the altar. And the Gemara counters, on the contrary, the libations are considered to accompany the blood, since the atonement that is effected by the presentation of the blood is followed by the joy that is displayed in the libation of the wine. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So rather, one must say that since the frankincense comes together with the meal offering in one vessel, while the blood is not brought together with the libations in one vessel, the blood is not comparable to the meal offering. But when it is explained that the expression, the other items that come as a requirement for the meal offering, is referring to the wood, this means that just as the meal offering is rendered fit by means of the wood, so too all offerings that are rendered fit by means of the wood are the ones that require salting. And the Gemara asks, but why not say, just as the item mentioned in the detail, i.e. the handful of the meal offering is clearly defined as an item for which other items come as a requirement, and in addition it renders other items permitted, so too anything that is unique in that other items come as a requirement for it, and it renders other items permitted, these are the things that require application of salt. And then what would be included in this derivation? Frankincense that comes in the bowls that are placed on the showbread, placed upon the showbread, as it renders the bread permitted to be eaten. But every other item should not be included. So now we would salt meal offerings and we would salt the frankincense, but we would not salt the sacrificial portions of animal offerings. And the Gemara answers, it is apparent that all other items require only the factor of having other items come as a requirement for them to be considered similar to the meal offering. And this is clear from the fact that in the case of blood, which is similar to the meal offering only in that it renders the offering permitted, like removing the handful and burning it, renders the meal offering permitted to be eaten. Collecting the blood and sprinkling it on the altar permits, right, the edible portion of sin offering and peace offering to be eaten, and the burnable portions of those offerings and the burnt offering to be burned on the altar. I'm going to read that again. It is apparent that all other items require only the factor of having other items come as a requirement for them to be considered similar to the meal offering. And this is clear from the fact that in the case of the blood, which is similar to the meal offering only in that it renders the offering permitted, it was necessary to teach that salt is not placed on blood by means of the phrase, neither shall you suffer the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your meal offering, from which it is derived, but not from your blood. Had it been necessary for all items to have both aspects in common with the meal offering, there would be no need for a derivation to exclude blood. By inference, these other items derived from a meal offering are similar to it in only one respect. And what is that? That they are burned on the altar and wood is required for that. That's where we will stop. Just take one question from Andy Schiller. What are the libations? Beer, wine, liquor? Salt is great in beer. So the libations doesn't mean that the priests were having a drink as they were bringing these offerings in the Holy Temple. Quite the contrary, it's expressly prohibited for the priests to drink and to consume any alcohol while they are doing the avodah, while they're doing the divine service in the Holy Temple. What libations meant was that certain offerings would be accompanied by wine, but that wine would be poured out on a special place on the altar in the courtyard of the temple. There were certain holes in the altar for that purpose, but it was considered, adding to the joy of bringing an offering. Right? Because the whole idea of an offering, which we're translating as offering, but the word korban has also that sense of coming near, right? So by engaging in the service of God, by following the commandments that God has given us, we come near to God. Now, we no longer have the offerings. What has replaced the offerings? Prayer, right? So when we daven 3 times a day, when we say the morning, afternoon, and evening prayer, like offerings were brought in the temple, now we have the opportunity to come near, to feel closer to God and to God's presence by what has replaced the offerings, which are the morning, afternoon, and evening prayers. That's, and as well as other commandments, right? Every time we follow commandments that God has given us, that's a way of coming near and doing God's will. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a good night.